Welcome to the verse-by-verse study of the book of Proverbs. We shall finish chapter 10 today, beginning with verse 13. Wisdom is found on the lips of the discerning, but a rod is for the back of him who lacks judgment. Again, we see a familiar structure of this proverb. We have two contrasting statements separated by a but. The author is comparing those with the wisdom of God with those that have rejected God's wisdom. Here, one of the many blessings of God's wisdom is the capacity, the gift of discernment, to truly know through the Spirit what is right and what is wrong. Without God's discernment, right and wrong become relative and meaningless. As stated here in Proverbs 12, all the ways of a man are pure in what? His own eyes. Man in his own wisdom always attempts to rationalize, to justify any of his behavior and claim that it is right, it is pure, and it is wise. Warns, God's wisdom should be the influence over our judgment. If not, we'll be walking a path that leads to pain. Pain described here as a rod that strikes our back. We'll discuss more about this metaphor of the rod and what it means. It's called in Hebrew a shebet when we discuss corporal punishment. Now next we have the wise store up knowledge, but the mouth of the fool invites destruction. Again, we see this contrast between the godly wise and the worldly fool, or the worldly wise. To store up means to treasure, to appreciate, to seek God's wisdom. Also, store up means to keep wisdom in a safe place, to be used when needed, as opposed to the fool who arrogantly thinks of himself as wise and allows his mouth to bring harm to himself and also to others. Now next, the author will make more of a general statement. Let's take a look at verse 15. The wealth of the rich man is his fortified city, but poverty is the ruin of the poor. Here the author is comparing two folks, a foolish rich person and a foolish poor person, both of whom have rejected God's wisdom. He says that the foolish rich put their faith, their security comes from their wealth. But the foolish poor who have rejected God's wisdom, who have rejected God, have no place to place their security. Next we have the wages of the righteous, meaning those that follow God's wisdom, is life. But the earnings of the wicked, those that reject God's wisdom, are sin and death. Then we continue with that same theme in verse 17. Whoever heeds discipline, meaning following God's wisdom, shows the way to life. But whoever ignores correction, meaning God's instructions, his wisdom, leads others astray. The verse is telling us those that are righteous, those that follow God and his wisdom, will indeed have an abundant life. But the sad wages of those that reject God's wisdom is a life of sin and of spiritual death, meaning a separation from God and his blessings and his fellowship. And they bear the brunt of the full consequences of their sin, for not only themselves, but those that follow them. Next, whoever conceals hatred with lying lips and spreads slander is a fool. So we have a definition of one of the definitions of a fool. Here, rather than having a but, we see the conjunction and. And so it means these two statements are related. They're both examples of someone that has rejected God's wisdom. The first person is a person that has a hard heart, a heart of hatred versus love. And they attempt to hide that by this underlying hate with insincere lying lips. And then we have the second person, which is related, is a slanderer. A slanderer is one that purposely spreads half-truths and falsehoods to harm others. Next, verse 19. Sin is not ended by multiplying words, but the prudent hold their tongues. Another translation in the NASB, when there are many words, transgression is unavoidable, but he who restrains his lips is wise. Again, this is a fact. The more you and I talk, the more likelihood is that we'll say something to offend someone, or even lie, or make some insincere promise, or to simply demonstrate how on that subject we are indeed a fool. The wise and the prudent avoid many of these transgressions. How? By allowing God's wisdom to guide their speech, their words, their tongue. Now this same theme continues in the next two verses. The tongue of the righteous, meaning those that follow God, follow his wisdom. The tongue of the righteous is choice silver, but the heart of the wicked is of little value. The lips of the righteous nourish many, but fools die for lack of sense. Again, the contents and condition of our heart is revealed by what comes out of our mouth. If God's wisdom is written on the tablet of our heart, like we talked about in chapter 7, verse 3, the words will serve to nourish others and be valuable to everyone, as choice as silver. But the words of the foolish, without God's wisdom, have little value for anyone. The blessing of the Lord brings wealth, without painful toil for it. The word for wealth here is not material wealth, but the wealth is something much more valuable. The wealth of peace and joy in experiencing a purposeful, meaningful life. This warning that one can toil away, they can work their entire life trying to find this peace. But without God's wisdom, there is no peace and purpose. A fool finds pleasure in wicked schemes, but a person of understanding of God's wisdom delights in that wisdom. Again, we see the contrast. The fool takes perverted pleasure in devising these complicated, clever, elaborate schemes, these ways to take advantage of others. As opposed to the wise, which in some ways is simple, they find pleasure using God's gift of wisdom to help others. What the wicked dread will overtake them. What the righteous desire will be granted. The promise here is all those that choose to live in sin will live in fear that that sin will be not only revealed, but they'll eventually suffer the consequences of that sin. God made a clear promise. We will reap, we will harvest what we plant, what we sow. We'll either reap the fruit of our wrongs or reap the fruit of our rights, which are led by God's Spirit and wisdom. The same theme continues in verse 25. When the storms has swept by, the wicked are gone, but the righteous stand firm forever. Again, we have a godly promise. The promise is the righteous will always have the firm foundation of God, and therefore be able to withstand any challenge, any storm of life. Unlike the wicked, who have to face or attempt to face, to deal with these storms of life in their own strength, and as a result will be swept away. Now the theme of laziness. As vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes, so are the sluggards to those who send them. Being lazy is a choice. It's also against God's will, against God's wisdom. Why? Because it brings harm to both the person and to those that put their trust in that person. And now we have a repeat from the very first chapter, a powerful statement. Let's take a look. The fear of the Lord adds length to life, but the years of the wicked are cut short. Again, the fear of the Lord means to honor, to respect, to follow God's wisdom, which brings about these blessings of abundant life. Not necessarily a longer life, but an abundant life, which brings about peace, purpose, and joy, which is the opposite of those that reject God's love and his assistance, which brings only anxiety and hopelessness to life. And now we'll close with the final 5 verses that compares the wicked versus the righteous, or also called the blameless. The prospect of the righteous is joy, but the hopes of the wicked come to nothing. The way of the Lord is a refuge for the blameless, but it is a ruin to those who do evil. The righteous will never be uprooted, but the wicked will not remain in the land. Again, the author is trying to hammer home his argument that those that choose God and God's wisdom, there is joy, there's peace, and there's security. And there's just the opposite for those that reject it. Now we close with those final. From the mouth of the righteous comes the fruit of wisdom, but a perverse tongue will be silenced. The lips of the righteous know what finds favor, but the mouth of the wicked only what is perverse. Again, the mouth of the wicked invariably, eventually bears perversion, which is sin, as opposed to the mouth of the righteous that always bears godly fruit. That ends chapter 10. We shall begin chapter 11 next week. Until then, may God bless you and your family with both grace and peace. Aloha.